Have you ever accidentally killed someone? How are you dealing with it now? Serious. When I was 17, someone broke into my house when it was just me and my younger sister home. I heard him kick in a window, so I grabbed my father's gun, ran upstairs to my sister's room, she was asleep, locked us in, and called the police. He heard me running through the house and knew where I was. He started taunting me saying he would kill us if we didn't stay quiet. Then he tried to break down the bedroom door. I was on the phone with the dispatcher and was screaming at him that I had a gun and would shoot him. I remember screaming and my sister just crying because she didn't know what was happening and the lock broke, and I asked the dispatcher if I could shoot, and then I did. And he died. And I'm a killer. It's hard to live in normal society being a killer. 15 years later, and even though I'm married and have a good job, I still don't think of myself as a regular person. When I was 14 or so, my father picked me up from school in a conversion van, and when we were driving home, a smaller car pulled out of a parking lot not 30 feet in front of us. My father hit the brakes, but to no avail, and T-boned the car. The man driving the car was 91 years old and more than likely shouldn't have been driving. He ended up dying a week later in the hospital from injuries sustained in the wreck. It wasn't my father's fault, no charges were brought against him, but after the man died it really got to my father that he had inadvertently been at fault for killing a person. This happened now 15 plus years ago, and he still won't talk about it. My mother said it really bothered him for quite some time though. First ever post. Working as a medical tech in an ER many years ago, I had to take a patient to our court scanner. He wasn't from my room. I was helping out another tech, so I had no idea what his problem was. A nice old gent. We chatted a little as we made our way to the door out of the ER, but mostly he was quiet. I said, "Okay, gonna be a little bump here." It was an automatic door and had a little threshold you had to go over. So I push the stretcher over, it goes bump. Old guy goes ooh. I look around the edge of the bed and he looks at me but doesn't say anything. So not thinking anything of it, I roll him the rest of the way down the hall to court. We get there, the court tech takes one look at him and calls a code. Much activity and mess later, they call it, and the man has died. What happened is that he had a AAA, abdominal aortic aneurysm, and by bumping him over the threshold, I burst it, and he bled out. It wasn't really my fault, it would have happened to whoever pushed him over that bump, but it was me, and so I felt bad, especially when I heard his family wailing, and when my co-workers in their morbid sense of humor made me clean his body and take it to the morgue. So technically my actions directly resulted in man's death, so I have killed someone. My friend was driving on the interstate last year and a woman jumped out in front of his truck, and he hit her pretty hard. He pulled over and got out to see if she was okay, and she was breathing, but it was very shallow and she was fading away. He knows how to do CPR, but he said he was in shock and couldn't do it. She was dead by the time the cops got there. He later found out her little boy had died a couple weeks before, and she was extremely depressed and trying to kill herself. It doesn't seem to affect him, though. He's always said he figured she would have found another way to kill herself if he wouldn't have hit her, and I think that's part of his coping mechanism. When I was 17 I was driving home from school. My dad was a Marine and he wanted me to carry. I knew it was illegal and so did he, but I kept it under the seat and told no one of it. Anyways, I'm driving down this old highway that runs directly to my home. This was in winter, so I was already getting dark at 5 PM. I saw a pile of garbage in the middle of the road. I slowed down and was ready to go around it when it started to move. Shit. A man stood up from the pile and dove in front of my car. Luckily I was going like 15 miles per hour. It probably still hurt though. I stopped and I grabbed my handgun just in case. He laid there still. I thought I killed him. Nope. He got up and crawled towards me. I walked to him and asked if he was okay. He was speaking Russian or Germany or something. I couldn't understand him. He got up and drew a knife. A big ass buck knife, and I knew he was on drugs. He was foaming at his mouth. He started towards me and I drew my weapon. I told him I'm armed and I will shoot if does not halt. He lunged at me and I stepped back and fired twice. One hit him on his left shoulder and the other in his chest. He went down and I called the police. I told them that an act of self-defense was exercised and that the assailant needs medical attention. I then called my dad. 20 minutes later the police arrived and arrested me. I talked to my lawyer and he was very helpful and we went through trial. Eventually the charges were dropped. I now am very anxious when it comes to safety and any sketchy situations. I went through therapy referred by my wife and I'm feeling better. I still think about the guy though. He just needed help. But it was me or him. I'm not sure it counts, but I'll mention it anyways. I had a friend in high school that came up to me one day asking for advice about a girl he got pregnant. I didn't know what to tell him. I just said that sucks, and I guess I would try to prepare to be a father. He didn't really like my advice, or lack thereof. The next day he killed himself. I may have been the last person he ever talked to. I know now that I was in no way responsible for what happened, but it still haunted me for years. The idea that maybe I could have been less dismissive and more helpful and maybe he'd still be alive filled me with guilt. It turned out to not even be his kid, which only made matters worse. I've since forgiven myself for whatever wrong I thought I did, but I'll never forget. Copying my reply from an earlier post. In college, I had afternoon/evening classes all semester, so was getting up around 11 AM every day. One fine spring day, I was doing homework at the computer lab at college and left when they closed the lab down at 11:30 PM. I was driving home on a divided highway when the drunk driver in front of me hit a drunk pedestrian illegally crossing the roadway, and then I ran over the pedestrian as well. The police, fire, and ambulance were there pretty quickly and were obviously pretty focused on the pedestrian. I waited by the side of the road until they were done. I presented myself to the first cop who started looking for witnesses. Had to argue with him to get him to believe me that I had also struck the guy. It wasn't until they found my cracked oil pan that they believed me. I gave a brief statement. They took my details, had me wait so I could be taken to hospital for blood tests, which it turns out I had to pay for. Headed toward home, dropped my car off at my mechanic's for the cracked oil pan, and walked home. Got home around 4:30 am. Left a note for my mom asking her to wake me up at 6:30 so she could drop me off at college the next day as my car was in the shop. I thought about skipping classes, but we had a you can't take a MACUP midterm that day. Pedestrian died. I can't remember which was more drunk. The cops told me that one had 28 back and the other 35. Drunk driver can't remember very much. I was totally sober and remember a lot of things, particularly sitting there on the side of the road, watching them work on the pedestrian, waiting for them to have time to deal with me. When you hit someone with your car then, depending on the height, they'll usually roll over the hood and off to the side. The first driver hadn't done the damage. The injuries that killed him were all done by me. I was the person least responsible for the accident and most responsible for his death. Pretty much flunked my assembler exam. Kept hearing the thunk of my two left wheels going over the guy's body. Freaked. Turned in a blank paper. Went and played Black Knight 2000 pinball at the student center for 2 hours. Went to student health for therapy for several months. Didn't work. Was kinda suicidal for a while. For others who hit people, where they roll off to the side and aren't overly injured, I think it's pretty bad, simply because of all the guilt and horror in hitting a pedestrian. For myself, yeah, it was about as bad as you might think. These days, well, I'm doing better than I was then, but there are still scars. I'm a vegetarian, not because I like vegetables, but because I have problems with death. Sometimes I get incredibly tense when bags or papers get blown across the road, and I really loathe those bits in TV/movies where they feel they need to shock you with someone getting hit by a car or a train. Other than those bits, I'm pretty much normal, or so I delude myself into thinking. One time my brother and I were at home, waiting for our mom to get home with groceries. We heard a loud knocking sound at the porch door, and figured it was our mom with her hands full. When I looked out, there was only a hand visible, beating at and breaking the small glass window panes of our porch door. I got pretty scared. I was around 12, and my brother called the cops, and called my mom to tell her to stay away for a little while. We just stayed in the house while this person was yelling and beating our porch door glass. It turns out that a man was walking down the sidewalk and possibly felt a seizure coming on, so he attempted to knock on our door for help, but his seizure began. He died on our lawn from the number of times that he beat his head on our steps. We never even saw his body or face through the door, just his hand. I never even learned his name or let it bother me much as a child. Now, I think about it more often than I ever thought I would. When I was 14, I was on my way to church, camp in one of those large coach buses. We were about an hour out of town when a car making a left pulled out in front of us, and the bus completely ran it over. It was not the bus driver's fault. The driver in the car just thought he had enough time, I guess. We had to sit on the bus for a couple hours while they tried to extract the people in the car. Turned out it was a dad and his son, both passed away in the accident. I wasn't driving, but it definitely hit me hard. The worst part about it, later on the following week we found out that there was an error and the church had never even booked the cabins we were supposed to have been going to that weekend. They had booked them for the following weekend. So we killed 2 people during a trip that never should have left the parking lot. I think it's about that time I decided church was not for me. TL. Doctor trip to church. Camp ended with a family crushed by a bus full of irony. When I was 18 I was in a car accident. I struck a vehicle with my car and the other vehicle, a Jeep, flipped. The driver died. For about 3 years I went through horrible depression. The scene was something out of a horror film. I lost my mind that day. Suicidal thoughts and massive amounts of opiates and anything else that could numb the pain. Lost all contact with friends. It was hard to deal with. It was considered a no-fault accident, and I've always heard the driver was intoxicated, so there were no legal issues. Today I'm clean and rarely think about it, but it was a nightmare I would wish on no one. It's like living in a shell of the person you were. All thoughts become cloudy apparitions of what you could have done to change things. You want death, just to balance what you had done. It broke me, but I rebuilt myself after nearly a decade. Many years ago my dad's cousin, we have a really small family, so he was as close to an uncle as my sister and I have, accidentally killed his sister with a baseball. He was 8 to 9 years old and his sister was 12. He accidentally hit her in the temple with a ball, and she was killed instantly. I've never heard other details about it as no one talks about the accident. I've only seen the long-term aftermath. My great aunt, his mother, developed a stutter and became nearly unable to leave the house. Her son, who is now in his late 50s, wasn't allowed anywhere but to school. His father drove him everywhere. He never went to college or moved away from home, never dated anyone or made any social connections so far as I can tell. He still lives in his parents' house. They both passed away a few years back. The daughter's bedroom is exactly the way it was when she died, bed unmade, toys on the floor, laundry in the hamper, etc. When I think about the situation it makes me beyond sad. I'm sad for my great aunt and uncle who lost their daughter, and sad for the brother because he has lived with the guilt of essentially destroying their family. On another note, going to their house for holidays was horrifying. Essentially there is a shrine to a little girl who died in the 60s, and I was never allowed to play with any of her toys that were lying around. A guy I knew at high school went on a hunting trip with his dad when he was about 15. I don't know the exact details of what happened, but it involved the gun he was holding accidentally going off and killing his father. Needless to say, he was absent from school for several weeks after that and was a visibly different person upon returning. Not sure how he's doing these days. There have been a lot of awful stories in this thread, and I can't possibly imagine how horrible it must be to accidentally become the cause of death for a stranger, much less a family member. My condolences to everyone in this thread, and I hope you all have happiness in your lives. My best friend gave me a detailed suicide plan. I didn't take him seriously, and he committed the next day. I will never forgive myself. I don't like to talk to people about it because they all say that it wasn't my fault, but they weren't there. I know it was an accident, but when I think about it in any sort of depth it feels like I'm having a heart attack. I ruined his parents' lives. I mostly avoid thinking about it beyond skimming the surface. It's easier like that. I will never be at peace with what happened, and I deserve to feel guilty until the day I die, but I also have to wake up every morning. Sorry/you/femme whale. Another car story. It was my bachelor party and the guy that organized it was slow to the punch and forgot to invite people. Last minute, we got 4 guys, 2 girls, and a few hundred donated dollars, including my fiance, together to head out of town to a strip club. I have pictures somewhere. The girls were cool with whatever and were actually fun to have around. The DD stayed sober and we had a good time and left around 1 AM. Driving back, I passed out in the backseat with my girl. We were on the interstate when suddenly we woke up to a huge bump and the guys in the front were yelling about hitting a person versus a deer or something. We pull over, radiator steaming, flat tire. I, confused and trashed, run up the road to see a bloody carcass, wearing pants, a jacket, boots knocked off, and no head. Cops came, never blamed or accused us, just standard questioning about what happened. We weren't the first car to hit the man. There was a Saturn with a broken windshield that was the first, but his scalp and eyeball were on my friend's oil pan. I have a picture somewhere. I was disgusted that he took it at the time. They blocked off the interstate, and we ended up pacing and talking to cops until the sun came up, and they did their police work. Not really important, but at the end of the ordeal, they were getting in their cars, friend's car on the tow truck, and about to leave. I went up and said, "What about us?" And they were confused. I said, "We are on the side of the interstate between Baltimore and DC without a car." They wouldn't give us a ride anywhere except the police station. I have a picture somewhere. From there we got a cab to a car rental place and got home late that morning. Spent more time talking to insurance companies and the cops afterwards, but never threatened to be charged. Next Monday, I go back to work and hear guys that work for a different vendor at the building talking about some guys that killed a man after the strip club. News had made it from one of us to people in Texas, who told more people at a different company, who fed it back to people in our city. Crazy. I felt really bad for the guy's family but not guilty. Granted, I wasn't really involved in causing it. I found out from the insurance company that he had 4 kids. No one knew why he was trying to walk across the interstate in the middle of the night. When I was younger, I lived in a very ghetto neighborhood, and it was normal for random people to knock on your door at like 2 in the morning every now and then. It was mostly just homeless people. One night we are all asleep, it's 1-2 in the morning, and I'm on my laptop when someone starts banging on the door. I think it's just some drunk guy, and think nothing of it. I then hear the guy shout, "Help. Please help me. They're gonna kill me." This is when a chill shoots up my spine, and I just freeze up. I hear my mom and sister get up. I go to see them, and we don't know what to do. We are obviously not going to open the door because of all the possible dangers, so we kind of just stand there listening to him shout. We hear him run off, and we look out the windows to see where he went, but we don't see anyone. We all just go back to bed and don't really talk about it. I know we didn't kill him, but it's always been stuck at the back of my mind that maybe we could have helped him. It comes up every now and then, but it never really affected us.